Hello everybody, I'm going to try to tackle the problem of evil in the form of cancer. Some people will ask the question of why does God allow cancer? It seems like it comes about naturally, and if there's an all-good God, why does he allow for it? So I have seen some Christian apologists try to answer this question, and I really don't like their answers because they just don't go into enough detail. They try to give a 2-minute response, and a lot of it boils down to, well, because there's evil in the world that came through original sin, basically Adam and Eve caused cancer. And I find that that's not a good answer. The problem is we have to really talk about the problem of evil in general, and why is there suffering in general, and how can suffering exist with an all-good God. So I'm not going to answer every aspect of the question because, quite frankly, there's not enough time, but I'm going to put links in the description that if people want to fill in the gaps, they can by looking at the materials that I'll do. But first and foremost, this problem boils down really just to the first problem of evil. And with this problem of evil, it can be divided up into two categories. And this is basically from William Lane Craig's big long talk that I'll put in the description. And you can have the logical problem of evil, and you can also have the emotional. This is what I'll talk more about today, just because people have this emotional response, like, I just can't believe God would allow this. I just don't like it. With the logical problem of evil, this has basically been solved by philosophers. There really is nothing that says God and evil can not exist. In other words, that both of them can exist together. And if you really want to know why that's the case, I will link to William Lane Craig's video in the description so that you can watch it, because it's like 4 hours long. So it's like a 4-part series where he gave a big seminar on the problem of evil. So you can see why this is such a big issue with giving a quick answer. But I will talk a little bit about it. So one problem that people have is that they just don't see why God will allow for certain things. And one thing I would like to point out is what's called the butterfly effect. And what that butterfly effect really just means is that if a butterfly flaps its wings, a bunch of events can happen where that little change in the wind can possibly brood into a gigantic hurricane. What this really just means is that we, with our finite understanding of what the future holds, cannot fathom how one evil act can ultimately lead to good. So there can be evil that fits into God's plan that ultimately leads to good. So you might say, well, how in the world could the killing of an innocent child ever lead to ultimate good? And as a Christian, believing that God is all good, we know that he is going to work that for his greater purpose. The second point I would like to point out is the idea is more from the logical side of things, is how do we know that we are in the best possible world? So what I mean by possible world is that someone would say, well, if we have, let's say, 3 worlds here, I'm going to call this A, B, and C. So we have 3 worlds. Someone's going to say that we have to be in a world where there's no suffering. So the idea is that if there's no suffering whatsoever, why can't we be in that one? Well, the reason from the Christian worldview is that we have freedom of choice. So the idea is that since we have a freedom of choice, this world where there's no suffering is not possible. In other words, God can allow us to have true freedom of choice and inhibit us from doing anything possibly wrong. So this world is logically not possible because God will allow for a freedom of choice. So if freedom of choice exists, then we will not see a world where there's no suffering. The second thing is leave these two things. And from a Christian worldview, we have two worlds. One I'm going to say is that there's like a lot of suffering. And then from this one, I would say this would be minimal. So the idea is that what we believe is that we exist in a world that maximizes goodness and minimizes the amount of suffering. We can always imagine that there's a world that has, let's say, more hurricanes, more death, more destruction. And what we take on faith is that with the way that God set up the world, He set it up this way so that there would be minimal suffering. So the idea is that this world is the one that we live in, and it's set up in a way to accomplish His purpose with the minimal amount of suffering. So it's possible for God to be an all-good God and still allow for suffering, but we do know that since He is good, He's going to limit what world we live in to the one that has the minimal amount of suffering. So at least from the emotional problem evil, because there's no logical problem that says that evil and God cannot coexist, if we really can take, I guess we can take solace in knowing that God is allowing for at least the minimal amount of suffering. So that gets me to cancer. And a common answer will just be the reason that there is suffering in the world is because of original sin. And we'll go to the Bible and just briefly read what that entails.